recording this meeting for our viewing. Thank you. Determined, practical. Wonderful. These are really great way to prep our minds here for future discussion. Thank you. And if you didn't type your word, feel free to type that in. So now I want to introduce our presenters for tonight. We have Dory Lawrence here. She is the manager of training at Oaklawn Psychiatric Center. She has over 20 years of experience in management, program development, facilitation, and professional development. She holds a master's degree in educational and counseling psychology from the University of Missouri-Columbia and is an ACE Interface Master Trainer. Her prior experience includes directing a grant-funded program aimed at mitigating the impact of trauma on youth, facilitating a community-wide trauma awareness initiative, and serving as program director for a statewide educational advocacy organization. We also have tonight Nancy Michael. She's the Director of Undergraduate Studies for the Neuroscience and Behavior major and an Assistant Teaching Professor in the Department of Biological Sciences. Nancy earned her PhD in, oh, I lost my spot. Nancy earned her PhD in Neuroscience from the University of Minnesota in 2012 and now applies her understanding of how the constant exchange between the environment and neurodevelopment influence and inform neural function and behavior. Nancy uses these developmental principles to inform teaching practice, compassion, resilience, and capacity building for her students and community. So now I am going to turn it over to Nancy, and she will talk about the background and goals of this group and how these upcoming 5 sessions will work.
Thank you so much, Sarah. Super excited to have everybody on the call tonight. Look forward to a time when we can meet in person again too. So just a little bit of background, right? So this is kind of a heavy book, but so many of the things that people put into the chat, it is relevant, it is hopeful, it is current, it is needed. There are so many, with renewed fight against racism, with coronavirus pandemic, there are so many ways that our community has historically impacted and absorbed the impact of trauma, but especially right now, it's so important that we kind of all, we all need this, and we all need to figure out ways to be able to come together. So the setup for this, there's a lot to get through in the book. So we thought, instead of just trying to do it all in one session, tonight is set up much more like a traditional book club, but because of the relevance to our community and the healing that we believe that this book can offer our community, the next sessions, the next 4 sessions, take deeper dives into specific topics, as well as offer resources, ways to get engaged, so information about what our community is doing and how everybody on the call or participating can also become engaged in this work in mobilizing supports within our community. So with that, Dory, you ready? Except you're muted, so almost ready.
There we go.
All right.
Okay, thank you, Nancy. And hello and welcome everybody. I'm so glad to see such a crowd at this book group. This is a really important topic, one that is really near and dear to my heart. So what I'm gonna do is just a brief introduction to the book and to these concepts. And then Nancy's gonna talk more specifically about brain development, and then we'll conclude by talking about recovery. So let me share my screen here. Okay, so whenever I talk about this topic, I always like to start off with this idea that trauma isn't destiny. Because typically when we make these presentations, they kind of have an arc where we talk about what trauma is, we talk about how it impacts our brains and our bodies and our development, and then we talk about healing. And so the beginning of the presentation can be hard and can be sad. So I always like to start with this idea that trauma is not destiny, that our lives are really the sum of our experience. So we can think about our lives like this scale. And on one side, we have difficult things, so that would be the trauma that we experience. And we need to put positive things on the other side of that scale to outweigh that trauma. So trauma is not destiny. We are amazing. We can grow and change throughout our lifetime. So keep that in mind as we kind of talk about the things that can cause trauma and how trauma can impact us. And we also all have different meanings for trauma. So I hope one of the things that this book is going to do for us is give us some common language to talk about trauma. When we talk about trauma, some people think of war veterans, just like the book started off with talking about. Some people think about car accidents. So I think it's really important to look at our language for trauma. So at Oaklawn, we use a lot of different words to describe trauma. We talk about trauma in a real clinical sense. Some of us talk about adverse childhood experiences, meaning the trauma that we may have experienced in childhood. And then some people just talk about adversity. So we may use all of those words interchangeably, but we are talking about the same types of experience. So I thought the book was really interesting. You know, it opened with this talk about a World War I or II, I believe World War II veteran that he was treating and his experiences. And that is really the way that we started as a society to look at trauma. So the first time we began to look at trauma as maybe a common experience was with veterans coming back from World War I. And we didn't have a lot of great treatments. We were still hesitant to talk about trauma, didn't really dive into it as deeply as we could have. It wasn't until 1980 that trauma was recognized as a psychological diagnosis. So in 1980, post-traumatic stress disorder was first introduced into the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. So we really recognized trauma as something that needed to be treated. Then in the 1990s, there was a landmark study that was done called the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study, which really expanded our definition of trauma. So we kind of started off thinking about it only as an experience from war, or shell shock as they called it. Then we began to think about it more in terms of violent activities. Then we began to kind of add in abuse and neglect. So our view of trauma has really changed over time. But one thing I think is really important that we keep in mind about trauma is that trauma is very common. So the Adverse Childhood Experiences study showed that 66% of people in that study had experienced trauma. So I always like to think about it this way, that trauma is common. Everybody has a story. We don't talk about it because many of the things feel shameful to us. They feel sometimes like family secrets, or as he talked about really eloquently in the book, they're so traumatic that it's difficult to talk about them. So when you see somebody that is upset or is having a bad day, thinking about, you know, what is their story rather than being judgmental of that behavior, I think is really important. So Nancy's going to do a beautiful job of talking about how trauma can impact our development. Trauma shapes our experiences. Trauma impacts the way that we behave, that we interact, that we respond to other people. It can raise our anxiety level. All of those things can be symptoms of having experienced trauma. So the next time you see somebody in a store losing their temper, instead of judging that behavior and thinking, what is wrong with that person? You might think, I wonder what they're going through. I wonder where this behavior is coming from. Because trauma is really much more common than people think. But we can all grow and change. Our brains are amazing. They grow and change throughout our lifetime. So even though we start this talk about trauma, talking about things that are difficult, we're going to conclude by talking about how we can all recover and we can all grow. And we do that in community, and we do that with the support of others. So I'd like to read a quote from the book that I think really sets the tone nicely for the things that we want to cover in this book group. So this is the very end of section 1. So it's page 21. So he says, trauma results in a fundamental reorganization of the way mind and brain manage perceptions. It changes not only how we think and what we think about, but also our very capacity to think. We've discovered that helping victims of trauma find the words to describe what has happened to them is profoundly meaningful, but usually not enough. The act of telling the story doesn't necessarily alter the automatic physical and hormonal responses of bodies that remain hypervigilant, prepared to be assaulted or violated at any time. For real change to take place, the body needs to learn that the danger has passed and to live in the reality of the present. Our search to understand trauma has led us to think differently, not only about the structure of the mind, but also about the process by which it heals. So trauma is a very personal experience. It varies across individuals, but it is a very universal experience. So I'm excited to welcome you all to this important talk, and now I'm going to turn it over to Nancy.
Thanks, Dory. I love that picture too. Beautiful. All right, here we go. We're going to now share a new screen. Zoom. All right, so as Sarah mentioned, I am a neuroscientist by training. And especially because we're talking about the impact of experience on the brain, I think it's important to just kind of build a common language. We all come from different backgrounds. We all have different experiences. So here's a crash course in neuroscience. Everybody ready? It'll be so fun. Okay. All right, cool. And if any point in time, if there's somebody monitoring the chat, we'll come back to those questions and stuff too. So make sure you're recording your questions as we go. Don't wait until there's like a break or whatever. All right, so here we go. Neuroscience crash course. What do we know about the brain? This is probably the picture that most of us are, well, not necessarily this exact picture, right? But a picture similar to this, right? It's the outside of the brain. The brain has lobes. People talk about the prefrontal cortex a lot. But they're one of the major themes in neuroscience are these structure-function relationships. So a particular structure or a particular part of the brain and its very particular organization is responsible for producing a particular function. All right, so the brain is made up of two major types of cells. Neurons get a lot of the popular press. How many people have heard of neurons? Neurons? Yeah, all right, lots of people heard of neurons. Okay, good. We've all heard of neurons. And then there are these other really important cells that we hardly ever talk about called glial cells. There are three main types of glial cells, but between these neurons and these glial cells, these cells come together and form the architecture of the brain, right? And in terms of structure-function relationships, there's a very particular architecture that's associated with producing the behaviors that we kind of socially expect, okay? All right, this over here on the left-hand side of the screen, all of the lobes of the brain from the outside. Here's a cartoon of a neuron, right? Neurons are far more complicated. They're beautiful. If you ever have a chance to look at a neuron in a microscope or a picture of an actual like filled, they're beautiful. They actually look a lot like trees, just much, much smaller. All right, so here it is. And so anybody know, you can put it in the chat, anybody know about how many neurons there are in the brain? I don't know if I can actually see the chat. Sarah, can you see the chat right now?
Yeah, I can let you go. No, we heard a lot, over a billion.
Yes.
80 billion.
Almost, yeah. So there are 86 billion neurons and 86 billion glial cells in the brain, right? We don't talk about numbers that large very often. And through those connections, right? It's not neurons that live in isolation. Those neurons wire up and they connect. And because of that very particular organization and the way that they connect and talk to one another, the way that they communicate, at those points of communication between cells, those things are called synapses. And there's 1 × 10⁻14 synapses in the brain, right? And again, we don't think about numbers this large very much, and that's why I just put it up there, right? That's a lot of zeros. And there's not a single, how many people are on the face of the planet? About 7.5 billion right now. There is not a single human being on the face of the planet that has the exact same architecture, synaptic architecture, right? We all can have a frontal lobe, we all can have a temporal lobe, we all can have a prefrontal cortex. But when it comes to the way that those connections in the brain are formed, right? They're formed by this constant interaction through our kind of normative brain development trajectory over time and interactions with our environment. So here's a quick slide of how much the brain grows during the first many years of life, right? And you can see over here on the bottom of the graph, this is the x-axis down here, we start at 0 years. So we start right at birth. And then as we move to the right, that's the number of years, and we're increasing, right? here along this left side of the graph, this horizontal y-axis, we have brain weight. And I get that it's in grams and we use pounds, but we're not gonna worry about that, right? As we move up, the brain weighs more, right? So you can see that starting at birth, the brain doesn't weigh very much. It's like 300, 350 grams. And over the first 5 years of life, what happens to the weight of the brain? It more than triples in its weight, right? That's a ginormous amount. That's a science word, by the way. That's a ginormous amount of growth in 5 years of life. And so I also want to use this opportunity to dispel brain myths, right? How many people, by a show of hands, how many people have heard the brain is basically done developing, 90% finished developing by the time a child is 5 years old, right? A lot of people have heard that. There's a tremendous amount of brain growth, but to suggest that 90% of the development, right, that figure came from simple brain weight growth, right? Without the capacity to think about or to measure or to look at what's actually changing in the cells and the way the cells communicate and the way the brain is actually wired up, right? But clearly that's a lot of development. So now there's so much more development. How many people have ever met a 13-year-old? Okay. How many people have met a 5-year-old? Can a 13-year-old do things that a 5-year-old can't do? Sure. Can a 30-year-old do things that a 13-year-old can't do? Mm-hmm. Sure. So whenever there's a change of behavior, right, to the best of our understanding about neuroscience, there is a change in brain structure. And so no matter how old we get, we can continue to learn, right? We can continue to change our brain. It becomes more effortful, right, as we age, but it's always part of the capacity. And so the reason, though, why early years become so important is because early years lay kind of this foundational, what we're going to call synaptic architecture. And when I say synaptic architecture, right, I'm not talking about whether or not you end up with a frontal lobe, or whether you end up with a prefrontal cortex, or whether you end up with an amygdala. We'll talk about the amygdala in a little bit, right? What I'm talking about is how those 86 billion neurons, the vast majority of those are on board at the time of birth. So when I'm talking about synaptic architecture, I'm talking about the way that those 86 billion neurons, and as those 86 billion glial cells add themselves to the circuit, how those very particular connections come together that formulate me, that formulate you, right? The way that we are engaged with, the way that we engage with the world and the experiences that we have create this constant cycle of neural development that ultimately informs the way that we perceive the world around us. So when we have different experiences in these early years of life, it will inevitably shape the foundations of our synaptic architecture, which brings us to this idea of critical periods or sensitive periods. Now, I know that everybody can read, but we're on a Zoom call, so I'm going to read to you because we're on a Zoom call. All right. So a critical or a sensitive period is a period of neural development in which the organization of the brain is particularly sensitive to a domain-specific stimuli for a limited period of time in development. So what do we mean when we say domain-specific stimuli? Right? That's like domain-specific, like vision, right? Vision is a domain-specific stimuli. So during a period of neural development, the developing nervous system is really, really sensitive and actually the developing nervous system needs visual input to wire up the brain, right? In the absence of kind of this normative visual experience, even if all of the eyes and the brain itself are fine, in the absence of this experience and this sensory experience that the nervous system expects, the actual brain, right, those neurons will reorganize and redistribute themselves to different functions because there's no vision coming in. So a critical period or a sensitive period of development is an organization of the brain, is a time during development when the organization of the brain is particularly sensitive to a domain-specific stimuli for a limited period of time, right? We don't get to have this ability to wire up vision for forever. It happens really, really early in development. Exposure to the same stimuli, either before or after the sensitive window is either ineffective at inducing organizational change, or more often the ability to induce such changes is markedly blunted, right? So that's a really heavy definition. It's super accurate. So we're talking about, so we expect visual stimuli. We expect tactile, right? We expect, so as a species, as infants, with an immature nervous system, remember how much the brain grows, it is an expectation of our developing nervous system to be able to see the world, to be able to touch the world, to be touched by people that are supposed to care for us. The biggest and most critical expectation of the developing nervous system is that we get to become attached to another person, right? Mammals in general, humans in particular, have a very prolonged period of development in which we are completely dependent on someone else for care. In the absence of that care, and care has to be, what can a baby do? Put it in the chat. Sarah, let me know. What can a baby do?
Eat, cry. Two votes for cry. Pee.
Yeah, right? Baby can't get baby's own food. Sleep. Yeah, baby can eat, cry, pee, poop.
Breathe.
Sleep. Sometimes they breathe, right? But I remember when I had my first daughter, I remember listening to her when she was sleeping, like right after she was born. Infants have these crazy long pauses sometimes, right? Where they don't breathe. And I was like, oh my gosh, Stana's gonna die, right? So all of this experience, right? All of those connections, those 86 billion neurons in these many first years of life, these infants go to babies, go to toddlers, go to small kids, they're developing these skills. And so during restricted periods of development, the experience with the world around us then determines the reactivity to the external world for the rest of the individual's life, right? That's a much more succinct definition of what a critical or a sensitive period is. But one of the most fundamentally important, in my view, right, the most important experience in terms of what we can talk about as species expectant experiences, right? So critical periods of development are tied to this expectation from the external world about how the experience is supposed to roll out to develop kind of like a what we would consider like a normal functioning brain, right? There's tremendous neurodiversity. We talked about this, right? It's 7.5 billion people on the planet. Not a single one of us is going to have the same architecture. But what do developing humans expect, right? Developing humans expect someone else in their life to give a damn always, right? Someone else in their life who, if baby cries, somebody answers, right? And that somebody is that somebody is gonna help troubleshoot. Oh, you're crying. Are you wet? Are you hungry? Are you warm? Are you cold? Let me help you troubleshoot. That responsive and interactive care, right, allows baby to be like, oh my gosh, I'm dying. Oh, no, I just have some gas. I'll be okay, right? That responsive care, baby can be like, baby freaks out. Baby's like, oh my gosh, I'm dying. No, I'm bored, but I have this gross motor skill now, and I'm gonna grab a rattle and chew on it for a little bit, right? It's through that constant interaction with a caregiver and caregivers that baby develops not only the ability to kind of move around and get access to sound, sight, touch, taste, but also these really critical features of agency, personal autonomy, right? So in terms of the species expectant experience, in the context of this book, we're really going to be focusing on attachment. It is not the only one, but it is out of early attachment, because without an attachment figure, somebody who's responding to us, right? Are we safe? Without somebody who's responding to us that's going to care for us, do we make it out of infancy? Right? We are our survival depends upon the responsive care of another for many, many years. And because this is a sensitive period of development, and there is this species expectant experience of someone to attach to, we will attach to whoever is supposed to be our primary caregiver, right? Who is the person that we are around the most, right? And we'll get into that also in a little bit. What I really want us to be thinking about in the context of this book and in the context of the conversations that hopefully we all continue are able to have over the next many weeks is that these early attachment behaviors really establish that synaptic architecture for everything that comes next, right? For everything that follows. And so if we think about the ways that we exchanged right from ourselves, from personal reflection, the ways that we were able to engage in our environments, right? How did those experiences lay the foundations for what we did next, right? So for what synapses and therefore skills do these early exchanges lay the framework, right? And implicitly, we don't think about it and we don't talk about it very much because babies don't do much. Toddlers don't do much. But then all of a sudden, by the time they get to kindergarten, apparently in 2020, they're supposed to almost be able to read, which is crazy, right? But so what does that necessitate then in that early architectural development for that infant? Because all the critical periods and sensitive periods are cyclical, they're repeating, right? And so we continue to refine and reorganize as we grow, but we can only work with what we've already laid the groundwork for. So we've talked about an ideal setting. What about when there's a stressor? So for a developing nervous system, what is the biggest stressor? The lack of a primary care, right? The lack of somebody who cares about them. Because so I know that there's a scorpion, but for an infant, it's really primary caregiver is non-responsive. For a child, it's really primary caregiver is non-responsive, right? Because the nervous system needs and expects that attachment to somebody else. So, oh my gosh, there's a scorpion. Oh my gosh, there's nobody to take care of me. What does that do? So again, from a sensory experience standpoint, all the sensory experience is coming in, right? We got vision, we got sound, we got sight, we got taste. What else? I'm missing a couple. Vision, sight, sound, taste, touch. Okay, I think we got them. That sensory information is coming into the brain all the time, right? And things that we have learned to be threatening. And so being not cared for from a child and infant perspective, and even from a grown-up perspective, when we are socially isolated, that is a stressor for our body, right? And ultimately, what ends up happening is this sensory information comes in, and then a part of our brain called the amygdala. How many people, show of hands, how many people have heard of the amygdala? Yeah, the amygdala gets a really bad rap for being like fear and threat, which it does do very well, but the amygdala is really like, we'll talk about that more. If you have questions about the amygdala, put them in the chat, and we'll talk about them next week. Right? The amygdala, one of the biggest reasons, right, is because it's responsible for activating what we call the stress response. Fight or flight response, people have heard of? Yeah, fight or flight response. Amygdala is responsible for activating that fight or flight response or the stress response. The long name is the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, right? But the stress response is activated by the amygdala, activates a series of kind of hormonal and endocrine cascades that ultimately lead to the release of cortisol. Everybody's heard of cortisol? Cortisol gets another really bad rap. If we didn't have cortisol though, we wouldn't wake up in the morning. So the difficulty with cortisol is when cortisol is around for too long. Okay? Under normal circumstances of stress, so when the stress response is activated, there's one of those factors that's released in the brain that shuts down major sites of learning and memory, right? So how many people have been stressed in the last 6 months in unusual ways? I have, right? And how many people are like, man, I just don't remember. I have no idea, right? Because when we're stressed, there's a part of the stress cascade acts centrally in the brain to shut down sites of learning and memory, okay? Which is fine under normal circumstances, because under the circumstances under which this stress response kind of evolved, cortisol enters into the bloodstream and is able to pass back up to the brain, and that takes about 20 minutes. Again, under normal circumstances, the stressor should be gone. Oh my gosh, there's a tiger, right? Evolutionarily speaking, you're either lunch of the tiger or you've escaped in about 20 minutes. So by the time cortisol is able to circulate back up and it shuts down, so cortisol talks to a part of the brain called the hippocampus, again, that major site of learning and memory. Cortisol talks to that part of the brain, and then the hippocampus is like, oh, okay, we're good. We can turn this off now. So the hippocampus has regulatory control over the amygdala. That is under normal circumstances. What happens when there is a chronic, prolonged stressor? That stress response gets broken, right? That is why cortisol gets a bad rap, right? Because under chronically stressful situations, those cortisol levels get higher and higher and higher and higher. And that is when we get into trouble in terms of the impact, the negative impact of physiology, right? Dory mentioned the ACEs study, right? That ACEs study, I wrote some things down. So from a brain perspective, trauma, right? Because language matters. Trauma is, from a brain development perspective, trauma is really stress dose. And stress dose increases in the absence of protective factors, right? So for humans, based on what we've talked about, based on what you read in the book, what is maybe the most powerful protective factor for humans? You can put it in the chat.
Someone said fear, relationships.
Yeah.
Love. You got love.
Yeah. So relationships, right? We are, because of this very central role of early attachment, right? We don't make it out of infancy. And so that means that me as an infant, I don't make it out of infancy, but something also has to happen in primary caregiver for them to want to take care of me. Because babies make you tired, they can't communicate, they cry a lot, they're sometimes really stinky, right? So there's this bond that happens, and a major driver of this bond is a neuropeptide called oxytocin. Now, oxytocin we talk a lot about in like the pop culture, like it's the cuddle hormone or the love hormone or whatever it is, but centrally speaking, it is what we understand is the major driver of bonding in humans. Okay? And it's oxytocin is not only responsible for those strong kind of familial, the infant primary caretaker bonds, but it's also responsible at varying levels across human interaction. Oops, we went too many. All right, right? So very, very powerful between parents and infants, between romantic partners. Friends also, right? We bond with each other, right? And oxytocin, again, is a major, major player in this. And how it ends up working, we think, right, is there's this thing that humans do that becomes really important for bonding. And that's like being together, this idea of what's called behavioral synchrony, right? Anybody that is familiar with the early childhood literature might be familiar with the term serve and return, right? Where baby serves, baby's like, blah, blah, blah. And somebody is going to respond to that and be like, oh, yes, that is a green toy or whatever it is, right? So this exchange, right? Birds, we can see right? Different species do it differently, right? Birds, we can see big flocks of birds migrating, big schools of fish swimming together. Human synchrony is when I do something and you notice and you respond in kind, right? You let me through that exchange. We let each other know that we are safe, that we are heard, and we are respected. And in the absence of that serve and return exchange, that essence of how humans gather safety from their environment is disrupted. But in the context of a developing nervous system, we have to remember how we learn. We have to remember that the developed brain is expecting, developing brain is expecting responsive care. The developing brain understands implicitly that it does not survive in the absence of someone caring for them, right? So in terms of the way that that brain grows and adds weight over the first many years of life, a lot of that weight gain is because individual neurons, so in this panel we have the same number of cells across the different panels, right? I mentioned earlier that neurons look a lot like trees, right? You get this expansive growth. These little neurons go from like itty bitty sapling neurons to big ginormous oak tree neurons. And there is no value judgment in the developing brain. The developing brain needs to be cared for, right? And so here are some, there's this phrase in neuroscience, neurons that fire together, wire together. So based on the exchanges that I have with my early environment, those are the connections that wire up in my brain during sensitive periods. And I just pulled a few of these quotes from the book, right? Children have a neurobiological need to attach. They have no choice. When we were kids, we had no choice. We had the expectation of this profound and deep and enduring love, and we get whatever we're born into. Terror increases the need for attachment, even if the source of comfort is also the source of terror. And then this one just made, right? I've never met a child below the age of 10 who was tortured at home, who, if given the option, would not have chosen to stay with his or her family. We cannot pass a value judgment, right? And that 10-year-old, that 5-year-old, that 1-year-old, right? We grow up to be grown-ups with that same foundational synaptic architecture. So we don't just suddenly get to be 22 and be like, oh, good, it's fine. I know all the stuff now, right? Who we were carries forward with us into the future. And it's not only about the environment, right? Our immediate environment. So adverse childhood experiences, again, from a neuroscience standpoint, I think about this as stress dose to the developing brain. We also have to think, right, for our community. What does our community need right now? What is our community experiencing right now? Because there's a whole lot of factors that go into the development of a nervous system and the development of a human. So from a neurobiological expectations, right, we've talked about species experiences. We'll get to some of these questions. These are captured in some of the breakout room questions that we'll send out in a little bit, right? But I think the biggest take home is that a developing nervous system doesn't have a value judgment. The developing nervous system expects care from the world around it, right? But out of this early exchange, again, it lays the foundation for all of these other kind of normative social behaviors that we rely on over the course of our development. Okay. In the last 6 months, the world has turned upside down. Okay. And we have all had histories, not only in the last 6 months, but in the many, many years before that time. And the developing brain doesn't have this value judgment. We do, maybe as grown-ups, we do maybe as, you know, in our jobs and in our employment, but how can we kind of capture this moment when everything is so destabilized and really work towards healing our community? Okay. Over the coming weeks, we will kind of offer a conversation about what a self-healing community might look like, right? When it's not just people like me, and people like Dory that know about the brain and understand brain development. And again, the power, right? What you put into the chat, the power that relationships have in healing past hurts, right? The power, right? That it's about the sum of experiences. And although, right, I might have some personal trouble with what doesn't kill you make you stronger, what doesn't kill you can make you stronger when there's someone there to love you, right? When there's someone there to know, for you to know consistently that they've got your back, that I've got your back, that we've got your back, and that, right, it's not just a hashtag. We really are in this together because this is our community. We all care very, very deeply about it. I'll turn it back over to Dory. We'll wrap things up and we'll get you guys talking in your breakout rooms.
Great, thank you, Nancy. That was really interesting and heartfelt as always. So Sarah, I'm not sure when we're doing the breakout rooms. Do we have a schedule for that?
Yeah, we can do it after you talk, or if you want to let people go now, it's up to you. I think we got a little off on the schedule, so.
Okay, yeah. Do you want to do one or do you want to do two?
We could do the first question. That's kind of a general question.
Okay.
Do you want to start with that one?
Yep. Let's take 5 minutes and do that one.
Okay.
And then I believe that question is, what in the book did you find the most impactful? There's a lot in there, so there's a lot to unpack.
That is correct. So let me just tell you guys all a little bit about the breakout room. So I'm going to post in the chat a link to a doc that has the discussion questions for both breakout room times that we're going to have. So for this first one, I'm going to put you into rooms with 4 to 5 people, and you can just to discuss what was the most important or impactful information that you learned from the book. So give me one second.
And if you haven't read, it's okay. You can just share about what Dr. Michael and Dory have shared already. Hi, I'm Belshana, everybody.
Thank you, Velshana. Yeah, so you'll receive an invitation. You have 5 minutes to discuss, and then you'll see a 60-second countdown. I also wanted to mention that we are very grateful to have a licensed social worker with us tonight from Beacon. So thank you, Rachel, for being here. And if at any time, hi. So if we know that this can, bring up some things for you as you're talking about it. So if you feel like you would like to talk to Rachel one-on-one, if you see a button that says ask for help, you can click that, or you can send me a message in the chat. Just choose my name, Sarah Maloney, in the drop down and let me know that you want to talk to Rachel, and I'll put you two in a breakout room by yourselves so you can talk about anything that's happening with you. Does that sound okay? Okay, everybody should be coming back now into the main room. Thanks for participating in the first breakout room. Would anyone, I forgot to mention to designate a recorder for your group, but would anyone like to share anything interesting that you shared or that someone else in your group shared? You can unmute yourself and speak, or you could put it in the chat if you'd like, and I will read it.
Well, we all find you very captivating. The topic so far has been something that we're all leaning into. So thank you for your presentation so far.
Yeah, that was really, really interesting, Nancy. Thank you so much.
One of the things that, this is Mark Lucky talking, but one of the things I was focusing in on as we were talking in the breakout room was that, one of the things that Nancy mentioned about the brain and still being able to develop after a certain age, that I find that very exciting, and actually I'm trying to learn some new stuff, which is really, really good. And it's kind of helping me keep my stress levels down.
In our group, we talked about different parts that were meaningful. So mentioning just how appreciating how much in the book did talk about memories and whether or not they're conscious memories, but how you remember. We talked about good information about kind of how restorative yoga can be and occupying that space. So in the healing part, talked about how kind of moving the stories were and how encouraging was. Again, Nancy, I need you to say the quote exactly, but that sometimes reading it was overwhelming, but the sorrow of reading it was overwhelming, but there was a really encouraging message, and that the only thing matched by how much harm one individual can cause another is how much an individual can help another person heal.
Yeah.
How important it is that we do that. So
yeah. It's at the end of chapter 2 or chapter 3, and it starts with these four kind of pinnacle pieces of the book in summary, but that our capacity to destroy one another is only matched by our capacity to heal one another. And I think that that's really the essence of what I hope that we all take away from this, and what I hope, right? we talked about how, yeah, that right, something even as simple as yoga, right? It takes a lot of courage to just be in yourself and allow yourself to feel where you're at sometimes. But right, in kind of dissociating from that, we also lose so much capacity to engage and to be loved and to be present. And we pass that down, right? So that's how things become transgenerational, right? That unless we take these intentional efforts to heal, it does just kind of get worse. And I don't want to, right? Like we might all be able to think of somebody young that we love fiercely, and so if not for us, then for our tinier humans.
I just want to thank you for the breakout session because I was so eager to see who I was going to get to meet. But Lexi said something in our group that stuck with me about sometimes we can do the learning this could hopefully help us with some of that victim shaming, because we talked about just, you know, what we're learning and how the cycle keeps happening and, you know, coming. I can't remember who mentioned it, but was saying how they didn't feel alive until unless they were talking about the story or the trauma. And the victim sharing piece, you know, some of us, we can maybe change our language now that we're aware, but also talked about how it could be maybe refreshing for someone who's been in that cycle. And now they can understand and hopefully break that cycle. So thanks for the people who I got to meet today.
And you will get another chance to be with your group again for our second breakout discussion. So you didn't have to say goodbye right away. Anything else before we move on?
Sure. Our group, this is Jenny Sears. Our group talked about how this has been a process really just for us to come to an understanding about trauma, you know, over the years, and then how we developed that process and that journey in ourselves and our you know, our road toward healing. So I think Tom mentioned it when we were talking about how our society wants things to be, you know, instant, and we want to heal instantly, and we want our counterparts and, you know, those we care about to heal right away. But this is a process and a journey, and so I'm really glad that as a community we're taking this path together to help others.
And ourselves, right? I mean, like,
yeah, thank you. Yes, absolutely.
And I'm like, oh, I make so much more sense now, right? Like, so there's definitely like that insight, right? But I think it's an important thing to keep in mind is as we continue this conversation, as we go through the weeks together too, that like, right? That's why we have somebody on the call, right? Like, because most of us, Dory mentioned at the beginning, most of us come to the table with some kind of trauma, some kind of ACE is represented in most humans, generally more than one. And depending on, right, there's a distance, Velshana mentioned the victim blaming or victim shaming, right? There's this distance between kind of what the neurobiology kind of needs and expects from the world around it and kind of the social narratives that take control over time to justify what's happening, causing harm to people. And so that's I think work for all of us to do as individuals is to, you know, how do we reconcile, or not reconcile, right? But we have to acknowledge that distance and lessen it, right? Like if we want to make this commitment to our kids, if we want to make this commitment to our community, right? Just because a child chose to return to an abusive household, right? There's nothing wrong. There's nothing wrong with that child, right? So it's those kinds of things. I'll stop talking. Okay, thanks.
No, that's great. Dory, do you have another presentation? More to say before we go to our next breakout room discussion?
I just got a little bit to talk about recovery, because we have to put the hope and recovery part of the message in for sure. So let me share my screen here. Okay, and can you guys see paths to recovery? Okay, perfect. So what Jennifer said was a perfect segue into this, because recovery is a process and it takes time. And Nancy talked about how development takes time, and all of the experiences that a young child has add up to how their brain is built, and that occurs over time. And so recovery also occurs over time. The hopeful part of the message is that recovery is possible. Our brains are amazing and they can grow and change throughout our lifetime. Mark learning something new is a great example of that. I've taken up yoga in the past couple of years and I continue to get better and better at it, so we can grow and change. And there are really three ways I like to look at, like three buckets I kind of like to put this whole idea of recovery in. Things that we can do individually, which I would say he focused most of his attention on in the book. How recovery takes place in relationships, which is also really important. And then community and spirituality, which I think he touched on in some really interesting ways. But back to this idea that recovery takes time. We teach a class here at Oaklawn called Mental Health 101 for our staff that work with adults. And one of the things we talk about is treating anxiety. And meditation is one of the best treatments for anxiety, but it has to happen over time. So we joke that we'll ask our clients to meditate and someone might come back and say, well, I tried that once and it didn't work. And that's like saying, I went to the gym once and I'm not a triathlete. So we really encourage people not to be discouraged, that it took a while to build the neural pathways that you have, and it will take a while to build new neural pathways. But it's entirely possible. If I can learn to do yoga well, then someone can learn to meditate well. Someone can learn to change some of their automatic thoughts. It just takes time and we have to practice. And that practice occurs best in the support of a community. So that's why not judging is important. When we see behaviors that don't fit in the environments that they're in, instead of judging those people and being angry with them, reaching out with compassion, offering support and resources instead of offering condemnation is what's really important. So let's dive in and look at what kind of he talked about in the book as these main ways for recovery. And then we'll do another breakout session where we've got some time to process some of this. But I have to change the slide. And it's not working. Let's try this. Okay. So he spent, I would say, most of his time looking at individual ways that we change. And I think that is empowering because those are things that we have a lot of control over. So I just want to touch on a few of these. And then if you've got questions, feel free to put those in the chat box. We may not get to all of them today, but we can get to them in the other sessions. So he spent a lot of time talking about therapy. And at Oaklawn, we do something called trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy that looks at some of the cognitive distortions that come with trauma. I am never safe. I'm not worthy. I have no control, some of those things. And then I was really intrigued by how he talked about narrative therapy. Now, he didn't name this as narrative therapy in the book. But narrative therapy is a process by which you rewrite parts of your story. And oftentimes what you do is you just work on the end. You know you can't go back and change the past, but you can reinterpret that and you can decide how you want your story to end. And for some people, that's really empowering. But he talked about doing this in what he called structures, which I interpreted to be, groups, like group therapy, and then through some of the drama therapy things he was involved in. Really powerful, where people take control of their stories, talk to the people that have hurt them, and come out on the other side and say things like, it's over, I can move on now. So I thought that was really cool. We've already talked a lot about yoga. There's great evidence that yoga over time really changes the way our brains function, and in some cases may even change the structure of our brain. So it's a very powerful intervention, but again, you can't do it once and experience all of the benefits of it. It's a practice, and we keep practicing and keep practicing. And the same with meditation. I was also really touched by some of the journaling in the book, the actual quotes from people. So for people who haven't quite finished the book, you know, keep going, because you're going to find some really powerful stuff in there. And the ability to just get things out in a way that feels safe can be really healing. Certainly not all, but can be really helpful. The EMDR process is very fascinating. He talked about that in the book as a really effective intervention. There's even more research on EMDR that's available now since he wrote the book. And I know that one of our Oaklawn therapists, Kim Neff, will talk about that in more depth in one of the later sessions. And then medication. I was super interested in his take on medication, that as a country, we tend to use medications too much with trauma, rather than using some of the other interventions that actually change our neural pathways and change the ways our brain work. Medication basically changes our brain by changing the chemistry. And Nancy talked about the neurotransmitter systems, and the ones that put us in an alarm state so we can escape, and the ones that put us in more of a state of happiness or contentment. And medication is certainly a really valuable tool. He was really clear that he feels like the therapeutic interventions are more beneficial. So I'd be interested what other people think about that. We can maybe put some comments about that in the chat box, or talk about it later in a breakout session. But I was really interested in that. And then the last bullet on this slide is the self-leadership concept. And I thought that was great, because a lot of people who experience trauma feel like they've lost control. And so self-leadership really integrates all of these things that he's talked about. It's really a bringing together of your control of your body and your mind, moving yourself towards the place that you want to be. So I really appreciated his focus on these individual interventions, and think that there's a lot there that's really helpful. And so I just want to say a little bit about relationships, if I get on the right slide here. He didn't spend as much time talking about relationships as I expected. You know, there's good research that shows us that relationships are the #1 builder of resilience. So relationships are the best way that we have to heal trauma. And I like this quote, that recovering from trauma involves connecting or reconnecting with people. And for people who've experienced trauma within relationships, say from family members or trusted people in their lives, it's even harder to establish those relationships. That's something I like people always to keep in mind when we talk about how we build resilience, and speaks really directly to the self-healing communities, that we have to be in relationship with each other, that supporting each other, offering resources to each other, connecting with each other is one of the best ways that we build resilience. And then community resilience was his last point. And again, I had some interesting observations on this as well. A lot of times when we talk about building community resilience, we talk about churches and religion. And in my memory, I don't think that was mentioned in the book at all. And certainly churches are huge builders of community resilience, but there's lots of other places that we can find ways to build community and ways to build resilience too. And then thinking about how we typically look at this builder of resilience in community, and we think about it as religious organizations, I thought he really touched on aspects of spirituality in touching on these communal processes. So you may remember he mentioned twice in the book being in Africa and being involved in singing and dancing that just occurred organically, that was very spiritual and very communal and very healing for the people that were there. His comments on theater were so interesting. And you know, you could look at the theater as a therapy modality, or you could look at it as a place where people joined who had common issues and common fears, and had a place to be safe with each other and to work that out through drama. And then art and dance and music all kind of are transcendent experiences, where when we practice those, we often get in this idea of flow. And in thinking about community and spirituality, I felt like those really connected nicely and really came together nicely in a way really similar to talking about building community resilience through church organizations. So that is kind of what I wanted to share about how we look at healing. And if we could just take a few minutes, I'd like people to type in the chat box just one way that they cope with stress, build resilience, one healthy coping mechanism. And then I think we're going to move into breakout rooms after that.
Thank you. Some things people are saying, horticulture, therapy, walking, dancing, yoga, laughing with my kids, mindfulness, prayer, traveling, walking, biking with family, sunshine, exercise, gardening, music, time with friends.
Great, thank you. Yes,
Makes
and
me
being in
happy.
nature is a big builder of resilience, and that's one that we didn't talk about. So thank you, people who shared. Okay, Sarah, thanks.
Yeah. All right. So we have another breakout room session. I'm going to put the question doc there again. We'll take a little longer this time. So we have time to come back. Do you think 8 minutes? Should we cut it just a few minutes? Okay. One thing I wanted to let you know, if there's any foster parents here and you would like to get a certificate for attending this, if you could send me in the chat your name and email, you can send it privately to me, Sarah Maloney, and we'll make sure we get those certificates for you. So in this breakout room, you'll be in your same group. Please have a recorder to record what people talk about. And we have options. We have 4 different questions you can choose which one you want to talk about. The first one is, how can traumatic experiences and positive experiences shape a person's responses, such as how we think, how we feel, how we perceive the world around us, the jobs we pursue, the friends we choose, how we raise our family, etc. The second question would be, how or where in your body do you feel stress? So how does it show up in your tummy, in your shoulders, in your tone of voice? What are some of your triggers? Another question you could choose, based on the insights in the book, what might some children, teens, and adults be experiencing as a result of the impact of COVID-19? Or you could choose, what are some ways that people can become protective factors? So I will open the breakout rooms now, so just choose that invitation. And yeah, so we'll bring you back pretty quickly so we can share. Welcome back.
We cut Kelsey off, so maybe she can share with the whole team if she wants to.
Yes, great. Yeah, if anyone who was the recorder wants to share what was for your group or put anything in the chat. Also just wanted to make sure that if you have any more questions, we have 4 more sessions coming up. So put your questions in the chat and we will address those in the future coming weeks. Does anyone want to talk about what your group was discussing?
I'll go ahead and mention something, since I think Kimberly and I threw Jennifer under the bus last time, and she kind of acted as our sponsor. We talked, several different people talked about where stress manifests itself physically for us, and it was neck and shoulders and into headaches, including migraines, for me specifically migraines. We talked about isolation, and I think several of us agreed that kids hated school until they couldn't go to school, and as they're coming back to, even if it's a hybrid, that socialization, I don't think any of us really realized how important that was for them, and the isolation that they've suffered through for the last 6 months. And then Kimberly talked about, correct me if I'm wrong, Kimberly, but a lot of the, the connection, and how do we walk with someone and build those relationships so that we can change, maybe help them change that path that they were on, or that we ourselves were on, by walking with someone who can understand and listen.
Linda, were you going to say something before?
Oh, sure. In our group, we just talked about how stress shows up, and probably similar to what others have said, which is, stiffness in the shoulders and neck, you get irritable, can even get sick, and clenched jaws, and the stomach drops out, rapid heartbeat, and those feelings. But knowing about the cause and knowing in one case, in dealing with some other children, knowing about the ACEs and how that expresses itself and what is needed helped in new responses and a new understanding.
Hi. Our group talked a bit about how, you know, when you have kids, you're looking to see those stress behaviors in your kids as well. And if they're younger, you know, it can be harder if they can't necessarily communicate that to you, whether they're, you know, too young or just not able to. But while it's important to recognize those stress behaviors in them, it's also important to recognize them in yourself. And kind of that self-awareness is, you know, really key component of understanding trauma in both children and adults.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing. We'll be meeting, it's the same Zoom link for the next 4 weeks. Nancy or Dory, do you have any final comments you want to put out there? I'm putting the link here to the library event if you want to register, to make sure you get email reminders, and I'll let our presenters make any closing comments.
I'd just like to thank everybody for coming. I think, right, like clearly I'm biased in this whole conversation, but I think this is a really important conversation that more of us need to be having and leading. And it's hard because it makes us have to recognize yucky things in ourselves that we might not want to, but to be able to lead this and really take an active part in creating, like actively creating better futures for our kids and for us too, right? Like we all benefit from this. If you do have any additional questions, I can sculpt next week's presentation. It's just a deeper dive into kind of the neurobiology stuff. So please chat any questions. I can also stay on the call for a couple more minutes to take questions as well.
Thank you, everybody. I agree with Nancy. Very important topic, and appreciate your giving up precious hour plus of your evening to learn more about it.
And hopping on another Zoom call in the land of working from home and coronavirus, right? Like that's no small ask these days. So thank you.
Thanks.
Nancy, can I take you up on your offer? There's a question I had that just after reading the first couple chapters, and I was wondering, it talked about the SSRIs, and is there any kind of a test that you're aware of or that science is working on that identifies levels of SSRIs in people that might be predisposed to how they might deal with trauma later on in their lives? I don't know if that question makes sense, but it makes sense in my mind. Yeah, and Dory or any other clinical person, feel free to step in. But SSRI stands for it's an acronym for a medication, so selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor. And right. That is not something that we would normally have, right? Like it's not a substance that we have. So that's not naturally built in our bodies. Right. And so it targets a neurotransmitter called serotonin, and serotonin is definitely associated with mood and mood regulation. And so there are a couple of things in terms of the quantity of serotonin that's available for communication at those points of connections in the nervous system, right at those synapses, is one factor that's variable across people. The number of serotonin synapses that we have is variable in people. Okay. And then for any neurotransmitter, for that neurotransmitter to do anything in the body, it has to have a receptor. And so the analogy that's used really commonly is like a lock and a key. The key only does something if there's a lock that it can go into. And so in this case, serotonin would be like the lock and the receptor would be like the key. And reverse that, reverse it. The key would be serotonin, the receptor would be the lock, but there are like
I don't know, 50 different kinds of locks that serotonin works in, and each of those locks does something different on the cell, right? So like the serotonin would kind of be released and activate the receptor, but that receptor can be 50 different flavors of all kinds of stuff, and they all have different, right? And and then what does, I don't know if any of this is helping, right? There's a lot of variability. And so there's some indication that it's like a different expression of different receptors can make people more or less vulnerable to something like depression. Does that?
Okay. Yep. Thanks. That helps.
Okay.
Thanks, Nancy.
Yeah, sure. You bet.
Unless there are any more final questions,
All right.
say good night. Thank you all. Thanks again. Hope to see you next Tuesday at 6 o'clock.
Sounds good.
All right.
Thanks so much,
Have a
everybody.
good night. Thanks so
Bye.
much.